So to summarize it, what's the difference between being in the States in the military and being overseas? Being overseas is fun, and you can explain away the garbage that you have to do because you have something ahead of you, whether it's a mission, whether it's a mission, whether it's you've got you're focused towards some sort of capability. I've had deployments where we didn't have a lot going on, and so we all found things to be intrigued about. Whereas stateside, there's always one more something that you could do. There's always one more online training program you could do. You're always at the office for one more hour for who knows what reason, and there's always some bureaucratic way to just add another thing.
Welcome to How I Embraced the Suck, a podcast where you get to hear from veterans what life in the military is really like. I am your host, Walt, and before we start, you should know that I do not censor the show in any way. You have been warned.
But yeah, I'll start on your cue.
Yeah. Well, let's just jump right in. Today we got Forrest, a former Ranger, and now not a Ranger but a podcaster. What's up?
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me on, Walt. I do a couple of things, but I suppose this is going to be one of those events where it's nice to have two guys who talk to a microphone and a screen actually have a conversation to one another. So let's see how it goes. Short background on me. I joined the Army when I was right out of high school. I was a homeschooled kid in rural Minnesota. Joined the Army, knew I wanted to go into special operations, went right into Ranger Battalion because I didn't know what the hell I was talking about when it comes to different organizations at the time, but we'll get into that later. And then so went into Ranger Battalion, did 4 deployments there, got out, and then I worked for a private contracting company, the one that almost everybody knows about, but nobody knows anything about. It's the kind of joke. And then after that, I stopped doing that. I went to school, college, ended up working as an editor for Recoil after a bout of depression and whatever. And then after that, now I'm here running my own independent media company where I talk about the philosophy of violence and how do we think about gun culture, and that's called the Redacted Culture Cast. But that is the elevator pitch on who Forrest is.
Awesome. Yeah, well, that sounds exciting. It's gonna be fun. I'm looking forward to it. I'm alive with questions, but I don't want to go out of order. So
it's on you, man.
Yeah, what was so you said you went straight into Ranger Battalion. Was that a recruiter? You got that from the recruiter, or was it you just excelled and were able to get that billet? What's the process there?
At risk of sounding like a self-help book guy, it was my first lesson in negotiation. No, so I had this idea. I had this idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a cool guy in the military. That's probably the best way of putting it. Now, given, I wasn't like a football track star or anything like that, but I had an idea of I knew I wanted to join the military by 16, 17. My parents knew all along, but I was kind of an artsy kid. So, wasn't exactly the highest expected person in my small town, but whatever. So I knew I wanted to go, but I wanted to do special forces, and that's all I knew. I was just like, right. I didn't Google it. This was 2007, 2008. There really was, we kind of forget how much information wasn't on the internet and how much was. And I didn't know anybody who was in the military except for my grandfather, who was a POW in POW in Korea.
Mm.
So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a pretty intense story, but I had this idea of I want to join the military. I'm going to be special forces because no one wants to be regular forces. And you're like, okay, whatever. And I wouldn't have been able to tell you the difference between the SEALs, the Rangers. I wouldn't have been able, I probably didn't even know what force recon was in the Marine Corps.
Right.
And so I more or less saddled in on Army because I think that was like the first recruiter I talked to. And I basically sat down and said, I want to be special forces. And he goes, well, you're 19, you can't. Or you're 18, you can't. It's probably 17 at the time. Whatever. You have to be
Oh,
21. You have to be 21 to join. I'm like, okay, well then what other options are there? He goes, there's Ranger Battalion. And I just like, okay, cool. I'll do that. And so he says, okay. And I'm like a buck 45, maybe 150 pounds, high grades, because, whatever. And then went to the recruiting station. Not the recruiting station. We went down to MEPS, and anyone who's joined the military knows what MEPS is. But MEPS is that kind of like the recruiter is. He isn't the commercial. He's the guy who gets you ready to go to MEPS. The MEPS is where it really happens. That's where you sign the paper. That's when you get your first physical. That's where you take the ASVAB. Now I was I was homeschooled, and my parents were very focused on education, and so getting a decent grade on the ASVAB wasn't very difficult. But I think there was some confusion as to why I wanted to do infantry. But because hey, if I can get my choice of jobs in the Army, I'm going to do the cool one, right?
right, right.
And I had this fanciful idea that as soon as I become a ranger, I'm going to be a cool guy. More on that later. So, and then of course, then I sit down and talk to the last guy. He's not the recruiter; he's the MEPS guy, and I don't remember what his name is, and I don't remember anything about him, except for he had a poorly lit office with gray floors. And he said, "Oh, we don't have any ranger contracts." So I stood up and walked out of the room, and it was like, and he goes, "Okay, let me make a call," and I'm
But
like,
this was a genuine. You weren't like manipulating him. You were just like, oh well, then I'm leaving.
I was just like, there's literally no reason for me to be here.
Right,
Like,
right,
because I wanted to do special forces, and then you're telling me I don't have ranger. I'm like, okay, well, then I'm going to leave then. Like, call me when you have one, because I'm not going to just do your stupid airborne contract.
right. And he's like, oh, this kid is good.
I mean, I'm willing to bet I'm willing to bet it wasn't anything other than that you looked at me and I was thinner than a toothpick and I had a really high score on. So like, we need to send this guy to nuke or something. I don't know what we
Sure,
want to
sure.
do, but
Yeah,
it's
that
just
makes
like,
sense.
and so I don't want to apply malice to him, but I'm assuming that like there was just some level of like, you really, you want to do the ranger? And I'm like, I want to go to art school and then learn how to fight people. So I was just like, well, I mean, call me when you have one. Here's my phone number. And he's like, no, I'll make a phone call. And I'm like, okay, sure enough, they have one. And so like, okay, cool. So sign the paper. And then it's basic training, airborne school, RIP at the time. Yes, I went to RIP. I didn't go to RASP. And then, back when it was hard, except for there's another story there. And then, and so went right in the Ranger Battalion. And that's kind of how I got there. I wish, I didn't know the difference between Special Forces and Ranger Battalion and Delta Force and Green Berets and Force Recon. I just didn't know anything about it. So I was a little naive.
Right, right. Well, yeah. I mean, I think in popular conception, or the common, the common understanding,
Mm-hmm.
Rangers, even though they're not technically special forces, it's like, well, they're special. They might not be special forces, but they're definitely a step above.
Yeah, they're an element with a JSOC team, or not JSOC team. That's the worst way to say it. Anyone who's been in the military who's going to listen to this is going to be like, "Oh, that idiot! He doesn't know what he's talking about." No, they are a tiered unit within JSOC, so they are definitely like a special operations unit. They're just not like they are what they say they are. They're the Army's premium direct action unit. Like, so they're the gateway drug to being in the special operations world, and they're definitely, they're human beings, so there's that humanity to them. But to put it gently, I think we had like a sergeant major or command sergeant major who came in once, and in his like and this is all vague information because I at this time I don't remember it very, very clearly, but he ended up saying something like, well, Rangers are just high speed 82nd, and he, needless to say, didn't last very long in battalion. And it was like, yeah, well, so I think that was an interesting thing for me back in that time. I wish I had kind of known it better, but how could you have is probably the proper response.
Sure.
Of like, in the military. So you've got the military, you've got the big military as a whole, and trying to understand its it's not only just its rank structure is usually pretty straightforward, but it's the way that it has organizations and tasks and objectives, and like, okay, so at the time that I was in, Ranger Battalion's primary like skill set, right? When you think of it, we've got a problem. Who do we call? Well, you could call the and this is not real. This is a metaphor, but like, oh, do we have to swim? Is it on an island? We call the SEALs. Is it a hostage rescue? We call the Delta Force guys. Is it an airfield seizure? We call the Rangers. Like, in a sense, there's this way that you look at different military units according to their tasking or their capabilities, or what they're and how do you measure capabilities, because all of this goes on and on and on. But Ranger Battalion at my time existed as a tier 2 unit within JSOC, which means that we worked under Joint Special Operations Command. And while we were overseas, our primary mission sets that I deployed for were high value target raids, high value target kill capture raids. So
Sure.
we did other things too, but it was primarily like direct action focused. We weren't doing sustainment operations. We weren't doing which can mean two different things to two different people, but we weren't doing like what the Green Berets do, which are the technical special forces. We weren't doing long form relationship building training operations with indigenous forces to produce a whatever you want. We didn't do that. We worked with indigenous, but when I mean indigenous, we worked with like Afghanis and Iraqis, but we weren't like, we had a different mission tasking than what Delta Force would have had, or what Green Berets would have had, or what the SEALs would have had. So
sure. I'm just thinking in my mind, who would be more insulted by this statement? Which group would be more insulted by this statement? That what the Marines are to the Navy, the Rangers are to the Army. Because
I've never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I'm joking, but from what you're saying, I do see kind of a similarity, like the primary shock troop, I guess, kind of, or
yeah.
Obviously the Marines are bigger, but
yeah, I mean, again, it kind of goes into also what contemporary warfare looks like, because in a traditional sense, I mean, if you look at how Ranger Battalion was started. Ranger Battalion was started in many ways inspired by the British commandos out of World War II. And given Ranger Battalion draws its history way further back, and because we get terms like Robert Rogers' rules of ranging, we get Francis Marion the Swamp Fox, and there is absolutely, like, I think I have one of my old Ranger handbooks on the deck here, or on the bookshelf, and there's certainly like a lineage in the beginning that talks about the history of it. But it's not a linear line. It's not like, oh, well, the Americans, before there was even the United States, started the Rangers, and then they just lasted forever. Like, we have a lot. We're kind of an on again, off again dating history with reality. So But in World War II, there was a certain observation made from the U.S. military made an observation of the British commandos and their kind of special tasking, special capabilities, a more elite soldier, if you will. And so they sought to create their own. And then since then, Rangers have kind of been stood up, been a thing, disappeared for a while, came back, been a thing, disappeared for a while, and this kind of weird stochastic appearance. Sometimes the Army has tried to use Ranger Battalion to be like, okay, we're gonna set aside a group of these dudes, we're gonna train them up really good. They're gonna and then they end up doing something really interesting, and then we're gonna want to disperse them amongst the Army so they can hopefully raise the tide or the capability of the whole Army. With mixed success. And so then the term being a Ranger, there's Ranger School, and then that means something else. And how all of this kind of stuff distills out to sort of, there's a reason why it's being a Ranger is so fuzzy, is because for the last 50, 60, 70 years, well, actually, yeah, since World War II, we've kind of been an on again, off again organization of very capable young men. So that's kind of the best way to put it. It's technically a unit. There is right under in our current time, there is the 75th Ranger Regiment, which is the headquarters element, and then it's got 3 Ranger battalions, and those battalions consist of very young, very capable men and women. I think men and women now, which is not a good conversation because I don't think there's any way. I don't think there's any way you end up in that conversation that's good. But
Sure.
But that isn't forced is probably the way to say it. But whatever. Needless to say, so there is this Ranger battalion, and then their primary focus is a more elite soldier. You want a guy who you don't have 10 years of time in, so that they're not necessarily on the CAG Delta Force level, but they have this very, 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 very capable unit in regards to small unit tactics. And so the most common movie that people think about is they think of Black Hawk Down.
Sure.
So, yeah. So they're kind of like, I mean, they kind of, and I know they've changed a little bit. I got out of Ranger Battalion in 2013. It's 2023. It's been almost 10 years. So I know that there has been changes in their organization structure and their equipment levels and their capabilities, and possibly there's all these changes that's happened to them. But while I was in, the main place that I observed it is Ranger Battalion was kind of like the young man's introduction to the world of special operations. So,
okay, sure.
Yeah,
that makes sense. I'm sure this is a dumb question. To be a ranger, are you always jump certified? Is that a requirement?
Yeah, there are very, very few exceptions, and those are usually administrative ones. But in order to, at the time I was in, the primary conventional tasking that a Ranger Battalion would have would be airfield seizure, which would require that you're capable of jumping out of an airplane. So there is the airborne ranger thing.
Okay.
I'm sure there's somebody out there who's been in Ranger Battalion who lost their jump certification and then had to go get it back again. I don't know how that works anymore, but they're one and the same. So,
okay. Yeah.
You basically have to have both.
Right. Yeah. Huh. So, because I've heard that it's not uncommon for people to go get a ranger tab just to promote their career and then not continue in a battalion. Do they go through the same level of everything and then they just get posted somewhere else? Is that the process?
Here's a primary misconception that involves the word ranger, and
okay.
It falls under that kind of term of commando. What is a commando and what is a ranger? And it almost becomes a metaphysical crisis of identity and stuff like that.
Sure.
But put very simply, there are the Ranger Battalions, which is a job title. It's a position held where you are on a team, you are a team leader, you are a squad leader, you are a supporting element, you're an FO, you're whatever. You are in Ranger Battalion. That would be when you put your uniform on, when you put your current unit patch on, you put a scroll, you put the appropriate battalion scroll on your sleeve. Sure. That is what most of people who are in Red Battalion refer to as being a ranger.
Right.
So when we get into the story, there's a certain crisis of metaphysics that comes to being in Ranger Battalion or being a ranger. And so, what does it mean to be is a joke.
Right.
But so there's the ranger scroll, and that is, think of it as you have passed the selection process to be in the unit and do the job. So you will have people who have never been to ranger school, which is different. You'll have people who have never been to ranger school who have the scroll and they've been on deployments and they've been doing the job. And then there is the Army's ranger school, which is it's affiliated but not kind of thing.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is there is still that remnant element of Ranger Battalion, which is supposed to be supposed to have the goal of lifting the capabilities of the entire military. And so the organizational chart relationship is Ranger Battalion is a unit. You have to pass a selection process to get into that unit. That means that you have to meet a certain physical requirement level. You have to get the approval of the instructors the cadre. They have to choose you of some sort. So that is Ranger Battalion. Ranger School is a big Army run
Mm,
Leadership school, that's where you get the tab, the yellow tab, big, yellow ranger tab. Now, what is the relationship between the two? If you're in Ranger Battalion, if you're a private in Ranger Battalion and you want to be, and you're going to continue your career there, you're going to have to go to Ranger School, because you have to go to Ranger School to be a team leader.
gotcha.
And so the Ranger School itself, although it's a leadership school that's supposed to a leadership and patrol based activities style school, which is a combination process of perhaps trying to teach something. I don't know. I learned some things in Ranger School, but in Ranger Battalion, your team leader doesn't want you to fail, so they make sure that you know all the things that you're supposed to know before you get there, which is kind of it is nice that when you're a Ranger private and you go to Ranger School, generally speaking, you know everything that they're talking about. You just are learning how to talk about it in the format appropriate to the course.
Sure.
But then Ranger School, so this is the point. Ranger School is then anyone can go to it, but the primary, most of the students who are in each Ranger School class consist of Ranger Battalion privates getting ready to become a team leader or gain some leadership position, and infantry officers who have to have a tab before they can lead a platoon.
Okay.
So therefore so now you have another correlation between the two, which is, well, a lot of people with the scroll end up going to get their tab. And then you have a third correlation of quite a few of the people who are cadre for Ranger School are people who maybe are, and may have changed a little bit, and there was a certain stigma attached to it too as well. But they are people who were in Ranger Battalion, who were at a certain rank but didn't have any positions to fill to kind of justify their movement forward. Like, for example, I've got my E7 time and I'm waiting to get my E8 time or my E6, whatever. You're waiting to get a platoon, you're waiting to take on a first sergeant position, but there's none open. So you'll go to Ranger School and be cadre there for a year, and then you might come back. Or I've heard stories of, like, somebody was in Ranger Battalion and something happened. They kind of got disgraced, so they went to Ranger School and they saw that as a form of punishment, as like being cadre there. And this is where I get to step back and say I left the military as a team leader. There was certainly a lot of chatter about it, but I don't remember anymore. I don't.
Sure.
I've gotten a little bit older and realized just because your 21-year-old friend said that Sergeant such and such, who's not a cool guy, obviously isn't that cool because he went to Ranger School to be a cadre, doesn't mean that I know what I'm talking about anymore.
Yeah. Huh. So, kind of a two-part question. You deployed both to Iraq and Afghanistan, correct?
Yes, Iraq was extremely short for me.
Okay. So then maybe, well, I'll ask anyways, and you answer as you will. I'm curious about the comparison between stateside service and deployment, and also a little bit the difference between Afghanistan and Iraq. But if you were in Iraq for a short time, that might be a difficult.
Yeah, I basically can't really speak for Iraq. I think I was there for like a total of 2.5 months, and all I really ended up doing was getting the flesh hurt by the team leaders with their boredom. So like if it, I was on a deployment, my first deployment, I came over mid rotation to Iraq, and it was not a very busy deployment. So the team leaders had a lot of time to make the lives of their fresh privates into either a training operation or a punishment experience. So that was a little odd. The environment was neat, though. It was kind of my first time in that part of the world. I was 19 years old. And I remember like the extremely thick, very thin, it's like micro dust particles everywhere. So everything got dirty.
Oh, yeah.
But I did not have any meaningful interaction with the population there. And I basically didn't leave a square mile for that whole time, with exceptions. So
sure.
It's hard to it would be hard for me to distinguish the experiences of being in Iraq from the experiences of it being my first deployment. So that was a
You
pretty
there?
big one. I'm here. You got me?
Goodness.
I've had this
You there?
issue.
Oh, I lost you. You're
You
back
have,
though.
yeah. I think when you're scrolling it through, I mean, I guess this is the breaking the fourth wall. I've we'll see how it goes, but I'll restart where I was just
Okay.
so we,
Yeah.
in case there was a glitch or whatever. But yeah, it's really hard for me to distinguish between what was my first deployment and what was Iraq. So I would not,
Oh, sure.
it was very much so young 19-year-old me, first deployment, didn't really leave a square mile for most of my time there. Learned a lot, learned how to drive a striker, learned how to climb a ladder with a caving ladder, learned how to do all these, learned how to lose my flashlight in a bounding operation, blah, 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 blah. And so it would be hard for me to parse out what was a first deployment memory and what was an Iraq memory. That would be a hard one for me.
That's a good point. I didn't realize that, but yeah, that would be because it's so blended together.
Mm-hmm. And it was pretty short, like I've anyway, I just don't, I'm not the guy for that. Like
Sure.
I was technically there, sure, pin in the, you know put the pin on my uniform, sure, but it's not like I was there like in a meaningful way. I was there in
Right.
my first deployment.
Yeah.
So but Afghanistan was so I spent I've done I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, learned Pashtun, so that was cool.
Mm.
But yeah, so the first part of your question was difference between stateside life and overseas life.
Yeah.
I joined at a time where most of the people who joined in the military and were in Ranger Battalion at that time joined because they wanted to be overseas. They didn't want to be on the stateside side. So it's not an uncommon statement to say deployment was like a vacation from the pain of being in the United States.
Sure.
It's probably a little bit wordy way of saying it, but the big difference between being overseas and being in stateside on the individual level in your own mindset is that on the individual level you could basically write off problems as it's not as important as whatever I'm facing right now. For example, I don't have to worry about death and taxes because I've got a mission in front of me.
Mm.
And that's a very that's a very dangerous drug because it does call to question the validity of certain things that we've fret over in the United States. But it also then becomes this infinite excuse not to face the things in front of you. The case in point, whether it's investments or whether it's time spent with family or whether it's keeping the home front in or the home together, it's really easy to say I don't have time to change the oil in my car. I have to go do something, or I have to go on deployment, or I don't have time to, repair my relationship with my wife or my family or whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
It's really easy to just say, I need to focus on deployment. But at the same time, deployment does have, as you get older and as you spend a little bit more time in the military, does kind of retain a small sense of adventure because it's just really, it's definitely my favorite thing about being in the military. Like if I wasn't married, I would probably never come home if I could stay in some, I'm not,
Sure.
People say that, and I know I'm wrong when I say that there is fatigue,
Right.
but and I was privileged in not in the American political sense, but in the actual sense of like in Ranger Battalion, we only deployed for so long because we knew that once you hit a certain point, the fatigue of battle made them less capable. After
Sure.
about 115 days or whatever, I think it was like about 115 days. It was the idea. Or was it 105? I don't remember anymore. That was about the time frame where they started noting battlefield proficiency started dropping off quickly. So that's about the time that Ranger Battalions set their rotations to. So, but yes, the big difference between stateside and overseas is overseas you can get away with a lot of stuff. Overseas is where you're doing the thing, not getting ready to do the thing.
Sure.
There's a lot less focus on administrative bloat. So those are all nice things where like, you get a little bit more, you're actually doing the thing as opposed to getting ready to do the thing. My time was a very much so either you're training for deployment or you're on deployment mentality. So there was no just garrison life. I found the idea of being in the military during a garrison is kind of horrifying.
Sure.
this sort of, and I'm wrong. I know I admittedly am wrong, but this idea of this like aimless, never-ending experience of being yelled at for not shaving enough or something is probably what I think garrison life is like, and that's probably needs to be corrected. But then so when I was there, a lot of it was deployment was a combination of anticipation for something that was difficult and like a validation of the training. Like we're ready to go do the thing. Let's go do the thing. Let's go do the missions. Let's go hit the raids. Let's go, go be ambitious and make something worth writing a book about, and not to be too Navy SEAL about it, but let's, even if we,
that's a question I was going to ask jokingly is, so you're a Ranger, when do you release your book?
Well, the technical answer is, and for the people who know me enough, is I've been procrastinating on one since 2018.
Oh, okay.
But it's not a military memoir. It's on philosophy.
Okay.
So,
sure.
So yeah, it's on philosophy and masculinity and strength. So, I might be if I actually get better at it, I'll try to get it out this year. So,
yeah, no, that'd be cool. Yeah, I see the point that you're saying though. How, and I've heard that a bit, that there's a distinct difference between being home training for the thing and being home in garrison. Like it's completely different. If you're in a unit that's not expected to deploy soon, it's a different experience than being at home, training all the time.
And I guess I would say I'm thankful that I never had to experience true garrison life. It sounds terrifying to me.
Right.
But I'm not alone in that concept, and in some sense, I know it's a little naive. Like you can't expect a perpetual world, and then we could rail about things like the military-industrial complex even while you're in the military, and say, like I don't want to be in the military during garrison. So it talks about like structure. You could have a pretty long conversation about social structure when it comes to conflicts and warfighting. For sure.
Being in the military could be described as a perpetual effort to escape the arms of bureaucracy.
I think that there's a certain attitude within special operations where people pursue going into Ranger Battalion, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, MARSOC, just so they can hopefully have the somewhat movie-like answer of saying, I don't have time for you, Senator. I have to go save the world.
Sure. Yeah.
And some of it is quite valid because the bureaucracy of the government is the bureaucracy of the government. The military is a government organization. Senators get their hands, senators and representatives and whatever get their will always get their hands in something that they shouldn't. Or maybe that they're not equipped to handle. Maybe things like you got to be careful who's determining the rules of engagement. But there will always be questions like that. But and that's you can't escape it. You can't make a fail-safe, perfect, airtight bubble that because we know that there needs to be a civilian military relationship. Otherwise, it gets very junta looking. We kind of don't like that. So, but
it can be bad.
It can be pretty bad.
Historically speaking, of course.
Yeah, we're not. They've never done a true. We've never seen a true fascism. Would be the best worst statement. It's like okay, right. It's just such a ridiculous statement. But no one ever says that. They're like, oh, true communism's never been tried. It's like wrong.
Right.
But whatever. That's a conversation again. So to summarize it, what's the difference between being in the States in the military and being overseas? Being overseas is fun, and you can explain away the garbage that you have to do because you have something ahead of you, whether it's a mission, whether it's you're focused towards some sort of capability. I've had deployments where we didn't have a lot going on, and so we all found things to be intrigued about. Whereas stateside, there's always one more something that you could do. There's always one more online training program you could do. You're always at the office for one more hour for who knows what reason, and there's always some bureaucratic way to just add another thing that was just like, okay, we don't need to do this anymore.
Right. It becomes much more of a well, not exactly, but a 9 to 5 experience.
Yeah,
Where
yeah, a 06 to 16 or 06 to 1600 minimum. So you're
right,
looking at about a minimum 10-hour days, but yeah, you're much less likely to get yelled at for missing a shave one day while you're overseas. But if you, Lord have mercy, don't smell like military base brand shaving cream,
right, right.
you know, like, oh, well, yes, first sergeant, just had sprouted my first hair on my face and I cut it off. That kind of stuff. And you're like, did you shave today? Like, bro, I'm 19. I don't grow hair on my face.
Right, right.
I'll close. I highly recommend you never refer to a first sergeant as bro.
Yeah. Well, that would
You
be
will not
interesting.
survive the
That
experience.
would be yeah.
But it is funny. So yeah, I hope I answered that question some. I mean, the
Yeah.
easy answer is no one cares about garrison life. You live for deployment.
Right, right.
So you just live for it. It's that's the drug. It's the fun. It's the meaningful events.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're home, it's like, sure, I can easily play video games, I guess, and I got to go do a training thing, and I'm getting ready for something. Maybe we got a good TDY.
Sure, sure.
Oh no, we're going to West Texas for a training operation. Okay, well, whatever, you know.
Hmm.
So maybe I'm not the right answer.
Yeah. No, that the insight's good. Everybody's got a different experience, so that really fleshes it out.
Yeah, and
So
that's
good.
it. Moving on.
Yeah. So what was the impetus for getting out, and what was that like?
Ooh. So there were the time that I was in the military. I joined the military because I knew I wanted to go on deployments. I didn't want to be a stateside guy. I knew it, right? And
Sure.
so at that time there was a combination of forces or combination of influences. One of them was let's start with the external pressures. The process of recruitment was not exactly the process of considering re-upping was very I'd say antagonistic at the time. Things like deliberately withholding rank for the sense of trying to get you to re-up. People who there's this sort of like, I was, my re-upping window was right at that like kind of 13-month mark, and so I was like, okay, we're not going to give you your E5 because if you re-up, we'll give you your E5. And I'm like, you technically can give it to me because I have to have a year left of military service or whatever. And they're like, no, we're only going to do it if you re-up. And I was like, yeah, okay, that was discouraging.
Right.
Another one is that we got the impression that my last official deployment in Range Battalion was you could basically write it off as being a non-combat deployment. We didn't do any operations at deployment at all, and so I would have said, so that was that looked like an identifier that deployments were starting to dry up, that we weren't going to be doing them as much anymore.
Sure.
And so it would be back to that no deployments, no mission set, only garrison life. So I was a lot, and I wasn't the only one, but it looked like the military was transitioning out of, like, we were kind of not doing things anymore. Little did I know this is 2013 and we'd be in Afghanistan for 7 more years and then invade Syria and then do all the other things like start sending Rangers to Africa and stuff like that. But let me rephrase that, not start, but continue. So, but at that time I was in this window of thinking, okay, Afghanistan is winding down. We're looking at reducing who deploys. I have a high enough rank that I'll probably make the deployments, but that's annoying because they won't tell me it. And so on the military side, that was an influence. Another influence on the military side is a new set of rules of engagement came down around that time frame. I was a team leader. And so it was very, very, I don't want to say discouraging is not the right way of saying it. It was, this is inhumane, but rules of engagement had been trickled down that I just thought were like fundamentally immoral. and the fact that we would have to abide by them reaches on the level of, this is this if this is the and it had been we had been in a constant march that direction. Each rotation, each deployment, it got a little bit different, but this was kind of a big nail in the coffin. And there is something to be said that I probably saw that more because I was considering whether or not I was going to stay in or get out.
Sure.
But there's some rules of engagement that came out that were very, very much so affected our job set, and it was like, this is untenable. That you cannot expect anyone to live by this rule.
Well, and also you're looking at it as being higher up the chain, being a team leader and everything, having to enforce it as opposed to just operate under it.
Well, no, I mean, the short answer is, how am I supposed to explain this to my minions, my battle squires, as you speak, who are supposed to be like, hey, if a guy's standing in a doorway with a belt-fed machine gun shooting at you, you can't shoot back because somebody else might be in the building. Is like, okay, we're not children.
Sure.
You entrust us with M3 Carl Gustavs and hand grenades. I think the whole goal of special operations is supposed to train the individual to be able to make decisions on the fly and make the right decision every time on the fly. And what this rule of engagement does is it takes any agency out of the hands of the individual and gives it to who the hell knows what, and then leaves them in a position where they're incapable of doing anything because they're more concerned about the rules of engagement than, I don't know, finishing the mission.
Sure.
And then, and so, yeah, I might get a little animated on it, but it was years later when I was in school that I really started to understand it. So a lot of this comes with the benefit of retrospect. So yeah, on the military side, why I got out, that was there. It looked like deployments were winding down, rules of engagement was getting untenable, and then the attractions for staying in were used more like a hook than there was more stick than carrot,
right?
And the carrot was clearly tied to it was a little bit, they weren't very good at being subtle hints. So that was a big deal. I also wanted to I wanted to be in on the personal side. I was interested in getting married, even though I hadn't met my current wife. I hadn't met my wife at the time. Well, technically did, but there's a long story there.
Right.
And so I was interested in having a kind of a quieter life for a while. There's a joke. And I just knew that being in the military was no way to raise a family. And so that's what I thought to myself. There are people who do it, but I was like, and so I got out of the military for those reasons. I just kind of, some of it is very foolish reasons that turned out for the better, and some of them are, good reasons that maybe were left unfulfilled. It's not a really easy cut and dry answer. I think I just ran out of interest, and if we weren't going to deploy, why would I stay in? That sounds terrible.
Right.
Maybe the grass is greener on the other side. Maybe contracting is better for me.
Right. So you got out with the goal to contract? That was your plan? Okay.
I mean, there's a pipeline. If you've got a decent enough reputation, there's definitely I wouldn't say that there's a 1-to-1 a guaranteed positioning, but there is a little bit of, at that time, I don't know about, I can't say the same now anymore, but at that time it was like, are you going to go to college or are you going to do the contracting route? And I'm like, I'm probably going to do the contracting route. I don't know. So
at your skill set and in your training, were the contractors seeking you out, or was it an effort on your part?
We just knew people. I knew a guy who got out and went over there, and I was like, okay, he's a good dude. And I called him, and he's like, okay, talk to this guy. And then I sent them my resume, and they did the checks and stuff, and they're like, okay, cool, we fit all the things. And this is where the special operations, especially that world, gets extremely cliquey. There's a very small circle and you ain't in it. That's just the short answer.
Sure.
And so there is a certain level of and everyone in the arena is going to have their own opinions about it, but my observation is that there's a certain amount of administrative side to it. In other words, checking people's backgrounds and making sure you fit the job description. And there's a certain amount of, okay, you have to pass a qualification course, and there's a shooting course, and there's a fitness course. But to So there is a doorway that you have to fit the qualifications to get through, but it's a lot easier to find the doorway if you know somebody who's on the other side.
For sure. Yeah,
It's
100%.
probably the best. So it's not like, I mean, when you're dealing with these kind of things, it's not like there's as many, giant advertisements, join now. But there is a little bit of like, okay, it's a mystery world for a reason.
Sure.
But some of that reason is bullshit. It's probably the best way to say it. It's like, okay, you just want to be a secret squirrel. Gotcha.
Right. Well, it gives an aura to it for sure. Like it attracts people. But yeah,
there's a really it'd be interesting to go back and try to look at how people separate myth from reality in that field. As far as like the process of like what it is, there's everything from super dark disposable black ops black so blacker that they throw you in a garbage can and you have to change your identity and burn your fingertips off, and you're like, is this real? and then you got other ones where you're like, where you find out that you're just a depot guard, you're just generic,
sure,
uniforms, black cargo pants, we're going to give you a G36 and you're going to stand there and look menacing to the desert. Okay. And no one, I've never used a G36, but you get the point. There's
right. Not made in America.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, whatever.
Yeah.
So the not made in America. I mean, okay, we were using FN machine guns. Are they made?
Right. So did you? Other guys that were in the contracting with you, did they? What am I trying to say? Was Ranger like? What was the spread of experience? Did you see a lot of guys who were just regular Army, or was Ranger like the baseline?
Okay, so yeah, private contracting world is complicated and tiered, and all of its layers are very much so socially held. They're all social constructs, if you will.
Oh,
And
okay,
so,
sure.
and so there are certain, it changes, and given this is all pre 2000, this is all pre 2021. This is before the collapse of Afghanistan. I'm not in, and I think to some extent Ukraine was a great reset of sorts to how
Nice.
the contracting world organized itself, because now you had people with years of experience who weren't over there, and then you had guys who were less experienced, less military, check boxes, who were over there doing whatever that it was. And so like there is a little bit of a reset that Ukraine produced, which is a little daunting because it's really pointing towards, like Ukraine being another very long conflict. But I don't think our primary focus is to be kind of a political conversation on this one. It's up to you. But then for the so private contracting at the time, there were there's all these different places you can go that you could find a contract, but whether or not it was a good one was a different question. Or find a position. So they were looking for security guards, and then there was this sort of hierarchy of, which company did you work for, and what jobs? But it was a little bit more like it was like an American job title, like, okay, here's what I'm looking for. This is the duties. This is the pay. I'll take this job, kind of thing. So it was very much so like, an American. There's a reason why we call it contracting. It's like an American job concept. And then with that, there were more prestigious or more expensive, maybe more financially beneficial positions that had stricter and stricter requirements, and some of those requirements were very public. And some of those requirements were kept behind closed doors with a little, maybe if you want to call it a little nepotistic, you can't get away from it, man.
Sure.
If you have to produce a team of really high performing dudes right now, and the immediacy of it is being generated by a combination of the fiscal value of the potential contract and the extreme or the nature of the job, you're probably going to pick people who come from a background that you're confident in.
Right.
So if you've only ever worked with SEALs, you're going to pick a lot of SEALs because you know what? You happen to know a lot of SEALs. Mm-hmm. So you're going to call them and be like, hey, we need dudes for this task force. And because you know more SEALs, SEALs are going to call other SEALs, and then you're just going to go down the line. Whereas, and so there is a natural risk of nepotism, but one of the great benefits of contracting is that so many people of so many different backgrounds end up over there that you get to learn. You get the sort of, in the worst of light, you get infighting. In the best of light, you get all of this kind of knowledge coming together. And so I worked with a lot of people who were SEALs, were Rangers, were MARSOC guys, were regular. I did work with some guys who were regular military, regular conventional forces. I worked with some guys. I guess there was a controversy. There was a controversy at a time where some cops got in, but I didn't have to deal with that too much. Thankfully, I worked with people who were contracting longer than they had started contracting before I even got in the military. So like, old dogs and new kids and young blood and all that kind of stuff. But the nice thing about it was, like, I think for most of us, when we started developing a little bit of a, at least in my perspective, I knew that, let's just throw a name out there. I knew that Carl was a SEAL, but it doesn't mean that Carl is of the SEAL cast of the contracting world. It was like, oh yeah, he was a SEAL, but it's kind of like, oh yeah, you went to school at Dartmouth, gotcha. Moving on.
Sure.
So there was a little bit of mixed levels of professionalism that happened there, and that also provided a really good, how do you say it? It provides a really good self-policing dangerous but good apparatus for self-policing, because if I know that you're coming from 3rd Ranger Battalion and I've been in this for a while, chances are I know somebody else who was in 3rd Battalion, and I can call him and have, if he can't tell me about you, somebody he knows can tell me about you, and so I can figure out whether you're a good dude or not.
Sure.
So there is that. This is where that small circle thing comes into. Is some of it is organic and some of it is not. But yeah, the answer is I worked with a lot of dudes.
Yeah. What was the contrast between being in the military, both in the U.S. and deployed, as opposed to contracting? Not necessarily the mission, unless you want to, but more just like the culture, the philosophy. Kind of, you were talking about the bureaucracy that exists in the military. What's the contrast between those two?
Well, I'm just going to talk about deployments, and I'm just going to talk about deployments particularly in Afghanistan. When I was in Ranger Battalion, my objective was offensive. Okay, we are building a. I would have not a threat map, but I would have there would be a target package per se. Does that make sense? Right. Mm-hmm. So like, it's a very distinct offensive defensive difference. That's the easiest way to say it. So while you're in Ranger Battalion, my job was our objectives were all to go after people. We were not there to sit and make sure that the airfield was safe. We weren't there to protect anything. While I was a Ranger, now there were other people who did that, and some of them I wouldn't have been able to tell you anything about them. Whether it was like, oh, it's the National Guard, or which is weird, or like it's the big army, or maybe I was a private and it just didn't even touch my brain.
Right.
Sure. Because I was too worried about being yelled at by my squad leader or my team leader or something like
about
that.
That stray hair.
Yeah, right.
Of which you were so proud at that age.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, whatever, right? I mean, well, it's just a phase, Mom. But it's not a phase, Mom. Sorry. So yeah, the posturing was very different. When I deployed in Ranger Battalion, my posture was offensive. It was, I am going after things. I am trying to figure out this thing. I am trying to fight this guy, figure this stuff out, hold this, very much so, like, that's the mission. Yeah. Whereas when I went overseas in a contracting capability, it was, this area is my responsibility, or these are my responsibilities of making sure nothing happens to this. So there might be some, you could even get weird and say proactive self-defense measures, or basically there
Sure.
was surveillance going on to figure out, to keep attention for potential threats. There was but it was much more, it was a defensive posture. Our job was to make sure this thing nothing bad happened to this thing. And that's all it was. So that was the big difference that was on the mission set side, and that bled into the attitudes of people within, because in on the Ranger Battalion side, when I was deployed with them, you had something to aim at, and so you could kind of orient whatever you're working on towards that, whether it's changing your fitness routine for a little bit to kind of focus on, okay, we got some longer hauls coming up. I want to make sure that my my gear works, so I'm going to do a ruck march with my rucksack and figure that up and whatever. Whereas like in contracting, it was a little bit more like, how do I gather more intelligence on what's going on in the area without breaking OPSEC for other people, and how do I kind of pay attention to these things, and that could lead to a culture of complacency at times, whether from us or from the people who hired us. Or it could be there was different dynamics, because we're like, well, we're a necessary asset here, because without us, the people that we're defending aren't defended, and so then you had to deal with like relationships there. A really good movie as far as that kind of describes this. A movie that does it well is that 13 Hours. The opening half of the movie before the bullets start firing is a really good example of what contractor life was like at the time, where it was like this weird simultaneous relationship of disdain and need.
Okay, yeah.
So it's a really good example of it. I think that's probably the best movie I would say that's described what given its Hollywood-esque approach to it
sure.
still, which isn't too over the top, I guess, but that's a good example of like showing what it was like, because you're simultaneously, you have a lot of time to go to the gym, you got a lot of time to eat well, some people read, some people are taking college courses, you're getting to know each other, you're working well with each other, and then you've got other people that you're working with, depending on what capacity you have, and so there's this kind of constant threat of drama.
Sure.
And that's usually kind of like, oh, somebody didn't like that we were working out too loud, so now you can't go to the gym until freaking 4 p.m. because someone might be sleeping off a hangover at noon. You're like, whatever, dude.
The bureaucracy persists.
It is. I mean, it's the bureaucracy.
I escaped it.
There is no escape. Yeah. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200.
Right.
Chump change. There's also like the negative side is there's a little bit of this like who's cooler than who attitude, and most people work that out pretty quickly. So,
sure.
Most people, at least if you're all hired within a team, most people work that out pretty quickly. So,
yeah. Especially you're still in a culture where you need to prove what you say. You can't just bluff. You're involved in, even if it's offensive, you're involved in operations, and you're with other trained people. So if you're talking big and can't fill your hand, it'll be known quickly.
Generally speaking, no one gets away with lying. No, in the long term, in the long form, long tail, like it is generally speaking, no one gets away with lying about their background. Big fish stories that are taken too seriously tend to bite you really badly. Right. I mean, there's in that side of the world, there's a certain level of reputation is important, and so there can be this feeling of like dog eat dog, where people are backstabbing each other to try to get new elbow into positions, and there's a limited billet, so people want it, and then they kind of there is all those dynamics. There really is, and if you're not willing to navigate the people side of it, then it's just quite frankly not for you. Now, that doesn't mean that it justifies the kind of brutish behavior that certain people present, but like it's not hard to it's really, here's an example of it. If you are not up to the snuff, and an event happens where that gets portrayed, everyone who watches you do the thing wrongly will go, and that will spread very
Right.
quickly through the network, and you will find yourself on less and less jobs and less phone calls and less whatever. Or if you have a
Mhm.
reputation of being a snitch, or if you have a reputation of being a dishonest guy, or if you have a reputation of being lazy, or if you have a reputation of being, the slow man on the team, all of those things, though, if reputation management is a combination of individual character, like you have to be deliberate about your character, and just kind of social interaction. And dude,
Mm.
I was a homeschooled guy from rural Minnesota.
Right.
It's not like it's a magical world out there. It's just how people work. And so most of the things that you experience when you find out people disqualify themselves are usually pretty straightforward, and they're not really negotiable. And then you hear about things where, like, oh, such and such got blah blah blah, and you're like, oh, that's really unfortunate. And things kind of work their way out, and
Hmm.
ego flares up, and it happens. Like, you have all these dudes doing the thing. Like, do you really think that you're going to get a bunch of guys who are high performers, who are trying to figure life out and do things well, are going to just sit there and abide while bureaucratic garbage makes their life suck? No. So, but yeah, that's kind of that one.
Yeah.
It gets tricky, because how do you want to talk about it? It's like, oh, it's secret. Well, yes, but
Right. Right. Yeah, there's definitely an aura about it. What did you want to touch on? You mentioned how it's misunderstood, the whole contracting world. Did you want to touch on that at all, or?
yeah, I mean, the common and I'm sure this has changed quite a bit by now, but the common perception of, like, private contracting is your generic movie bad guy. You wear black uniform, you carry G36, everyone think you bad. You're just a this idea of, like, the Wild West of private contractors running around with no rules of engagement is so laughably far from reality, that you need that you have to understand that person's perception of the world outside of America is no different than their perception of Lord of the Rings. It's a fantasy entirely. Like, and so I don't, and that is going to come across as derogatory, but, like, it is there, like, the world of private contracting is not the Wild West, where you just run around with no rules of engagement, doing whatever you want,
Sure.
doing secret black ops blacker than black, things to just go kill people. And did you know that they sent the Blackwater Delta, whatever you want to call them, triple dark horse people to go fight the no, that's not how it works. Like, there is not this this mass level recruiting with a public facing company involved in some massive conspiracy to, like, send special operations thugs to. No, none of that's true. What you find out is that the people who are involved in the private contracting world have very strict rules of engagement that are oftentimes one layer tighter than what the military has, because the military can say it was necessary for the operation. You, on the other hand, are a private contracted individual, so you are disposable. We can say you did it, not the organization, and that's why we hired you.
Right.
So there is a disposability of it, and that can be a little grating against people who are on the inside, but that's what we kind of signed up for. Or that's what we took the job for.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an element of that's probably the biggest distinction, is like this. There's this sort of fanciful idea that Blackwater is the Wild West of the world, where we go around hunting people. And I don't work for Blackwater, by the way. But, like, that you go around, creating private militaries to blah blah blah. It's like, yeah, that is a very, 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 very low take on understanding just the complexities of that environment. So, there is, at some level, and at some point, you are engaging on questions of legality versus morality. But that also applies to the military too. It's kind of like the same thing of saying everyone who joins the military is a baby killer. Like, okay, I can't take you seriously, because that is how else are you supposed to categorize the world? Everyone from China is a racist. Everyone from Russia is illiterate. Everyone
Right.
every nurse is a government paid hack to force the vaccine. Like, you get my point. Like,
Right.
it's like, do you have no perception of humanity, recognizing that individuals make decisions? And it's just because there's a bureaucracy to it, or just because there's a government involved. The government consists of people. People make human decisions. Human decisions are sometimes motivated by things that appear rational. Sometimes they're not. Right? Marrying a stripper is typically not a good idea,
But it's
especially
often done.
yeah, right. It's not. You may be the exception, sure, but like, it's just this idea of it as this sort of like as if the private contracting world is some secret dark money, murder bot. Is like, bro, I wish I could help you, but I might as well not. This. So that's kind of how that goes. There are rules to it. There's hierarchies to it. There's unstated expectations to it, but that's a big difference.
Yeah.
So I'm sure there's somebody somewhere in the world, probably with the name Wagner Group, that will hire people, or cartels that will hire people who are willing to be a little more scrupulous about their morals, less scrupulous about their morals. They don't have scruples. But like that's not a lot of people. I'm saying that's not a lot of people. It's just not the majority. Like, there's a very large distinction between something like how Blackwater, or the company formerly known as Blackwater, would work with the American government, versus like how soldiers would get out of the military and get recruited by cartels to train their dudes.
Yeah.
Pretty distinct, pretty broad distinction.
So when you transitioned from contracting to journalism, do you think your military history did that assist you in transition, both personally and then also in just getting the job? Like, was it like, hey, I'm a former Ranger, and they're like, oh, we definitely want you, or did that hurt things?
So journalism, I don't think I entered journalism as. I don't think if you had asked me when I stopped contracting if you had asked me when I went to school if I was thinking about a job in journalism, I think I would have said no, under no concern.
Okay.
No, right?
That's right. I forgot. I forgot you went to school in between.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
My bad.
So I went to school for philosophy and theology, which is, people who get out of like combat positions, like, an 11 Bravo Ford Victor team leader in Ranger Battalion, like, oh, what useful skills do you have for the civilian market? And you're like, I don't know. I'm going to go to school for philosophy for more non-marketable skills, right? So that's a great idea, right? But I did not. So when I was going to school, I did not exactly think that I would ever work in journalism. And I think the American culture made a rotation, or changed its approach to certain things during this time that led those two things to come together in a way that I did not expect it. I did not expect. There's one of the things, if you want to say, for journalism, is that, so I was an editor for Recoil magazine, and then I ended up a guest appearing on Tim Pool's podcast, or Tim Pool's IRL, and Tim Pool and that whole thing. Tim Pool is he's a news commentator, and he's a journalist, and so when I got hired by Recoil, I had already published. I had been published before, so I went to school knowing that I wanted to get into writing, and I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I'm probably not doing that very good, but I knew I wanted to be a writer, and so I went to school for philosophy and originally writing, and then dropped writing and picked up theology because I did more writing in that course, in that platform anyway. So then, and then I had a minor in history and then a minor in Greek. I went to school for theology. I'm a Christian, and
Right.
very much so in that vein. And so, but I did not see that journalism was going to be the way. Although, yet in retrospect, everything is so clear. And so, I did a long motorcycle trip, 15,000 miles in 31 days across the United States. My wife is a photographer. She took pictures. I did some writing, ended up in a magazine, which was Overland Journal. My wife is a very accomplished photographer.
Mm,
Her first time published, we were on the cover of Overland Journal, which is
nice.
really cool. And so that was sort of like okay, maybe this is an avenue, right? And
Sure.
you're foggy and trying to figure things out. So I graduated in 2018, and then I kind of wandered very, very, very poorly for a couple of years. Like 18 through 19 was pretty rough.
Mm,
Um, that's when I started dealing with like post military depression. I didn't have something to focus on. My writing got sloshy. I didn't know what to do. I probably drank too much.
hmm.
And then I ended up getting a job at Recoil, which was really cool. And I think that my military career had it was I don't know if I wouldn't I guess I could talk to the people, but I don't think being in the military got me the job, but it certainly was an influence because it was what I wrote about and how I thought about things. And so
Sure.
Recoil is a firearms magazine, so there's a natural correlation there. One of the other editors on the staff was also a contractor, so we could talk. It was
Mm,
there.
okay.
So all of these things had been a contractor in the past. So there were a lot of like connections
Sure.
that could be made, touch points of connections, but I don't think it hurt or helped. It hurt being a veteran, and it definitely hurt in other ways. If you want to, I don't know if this is the case ever, but if anyone who's listening to this exists within corporate America, I suggest you go to your HR team and you scry the hell out of them and figure out which ones have an anti-military bias and immediately fire them. Because I can guarantee you that there's people within your company, even if you're a pro-military company, even if you're a support the veterans company, go to your HR team and just cut them out. Get rid of a lot of them because I'll tell you right now that your HR team is undermining your company. If you're not, I mean, that's a little aggressive, but you got to be careful about your HR.
Sure.
Because because all the people who ended up working in HR that I went to college with were all the kind of people who probably shouldn't have gone to college because they're just whatever. Maybe they should have waited a year or two or figured some things out.
Mm,
But there was a certain element within that environment that holds a certain bias. Let's just say that they're able to hold without having it in what do you call it in policy. So
oh, okay. So like it's not an official policy of the company, but the bent
yeah,
of
yeah,
the
yeah.
people in there will still
Yeah,
affect.
I mean, if
Sure.
if I could if I could make a career on how many times my paperwork got lost, I wouldn't need to work ever again. But it was, I mean, there were multiple companies that you can't tell me that there's no way it was on my end after the amount of times that it was done. It's like, oh, you know how many times my resume has been lost?
Mm,
No
sure.
less than no, just, oh, we lost your information.
Right.
Yep. You
Huh.
didn't lose it. Your HR department didn't want, they didn't want it. It's fine, but
Sure. Just
it's,
tell me.
well,
That's fine.
no. It's not even just tell me. It's that your HR department is lying to you is what they are.
Mm,
It's very, you have to be very careful on it because I don't want to put it in a light where everyone who works for HR is the devil. But let's be honest here. You can do a lot of things without being public about it. And one of those
mm,
is, okay, so imagine, your company is looking to hire people for whatever job, right? So you put out a job listing, and that job listing gets a number of applicants, and then those applicants, you're making assessments on their capabilities. You're making assessments on their morals and their character because it does have a role. If this guy's not honest, why would I have him work for the company, kind of thing? There's a certain element of that. If I can, if I get the impression that somebody has, right? If you work in a warehouse, but you've been fired for stealing, probably not going to hire you, kind of thing. I can understand that. There are
Right.
elements to it. But so and these are all hyperbolic a little bit, but I'm using them as an example. And so now you get a list of candidates who all fit the requirements because your software has determined that these people's resumes all contain the material. And then your HR department has to take that stack of resumes and reduce it to maybe 10 ideal persons. And that person who is responsible for distilling a batch of 20, let's just say there's 25 make it through the auto sorter. And now, the final decision person who's going to choose who gets the next interview, says I need so many of them distilled down because I can't look at 30 people because that's reasonable. You can't
Sure.
look at 30 resumes and you can't look at, so many different applicants and whatever. And so then you get an employee who's working within that department who has a bone to pick because they met a veteran in college who told them that they were stupid because they're stupid. and this is not from personal experience, by the way. And then so now that person goes, all right, cool, and looks and hand sorts the resumes or digitally sorts the resumes, whatever, and weeds out all the ones that remind him of that guy who called him it was dumb.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, sure. Maybe if you're you're in college, you shouldn't call people stupid. I completely agree with this. I'm using a hyperbolic argument for the purpose, but
Right.
I can even pull it back. So now you have somebody who says, so your company is, we support veterans or whatever it is, your veterans get a bonus hiring position. They get a +1 to your hiring protocol, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your HR department will trump any policy that you put in place through methods of private grudge. And
Sure.
so they can do that. They'll find a way. And I can tell you this, it's the easy other answer is because when you're in the military, you're figuring out how to do things. Okay, we can't, we really, really need this item. You know what you're going to do? You're going to go find that item.
Right.
You will find that item. Like you will find ways to do things. There is the public facing side, and then there's the way that things get done. There is a joke about the E4 mafia.
Yeah.
But so what I'm saying is that no amount of public statements about supporting veterans or hiring veterans or giving veterans any preference at all, it is going to overcome the issue, is going to reverse the opinions of a begrudged or an HR employee who holds a grudge against people of a certain position.
Sure.
And sometimes those things are stupid. Like, I dated a military guy once and he left me or cheated on me, or that's a horrible thing to happen. Maybe they lied to you, but it is a hard problem to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
But that when it comes to hiring companies, you probably need to find out who's in. I would watch your HR team pretty aggressively because they hold the keys to your palace. They hold the keys to your company.
Yeah.
So
well, and your example does make a lot of sense because people that go in HR tend to be I don't know how to phrase it, but that kind of person, right? And
I can tell you who went into HR from. I can tell you exactly who went into it when I went to college, and they were communications majors who were basically illiterate, with a very, very, very vocal political opinions.
And the veteran that they're going to encounter in college typically is 4 to 6 years older than them and has seen the world and is looking at them and legitimately you are stupid, or you have not the life experience that I have, and I'm struggling to communicate with you. So it's very understandable that kind of interaction would happen.
Yeah, I probably should walk it back a little bit too, because it could come across as a little bit, how do I put it this way? I should walk it back in a certain sense of, say, we talked about this earlier with, not all veterans are blank. Not all HR people are blank. You're absolutely correct.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Not all communications majors are dumb, right? There's some people that I went to school with who are communications majors as well as other things who are extremely talented individuals, very, very hardworking, very, very skilled, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they went on to do whatever in life. But so so like that's kind of a, 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 I need to be careful in how I say this because I guess I get a little personal about it. But you cannot rule. What I can say is that the people who there is a certain how do I put it this way? Going into a position of HR can afford a lot of power to somebody who shouldn't have it because they hold a personal grudge based on their own personal decisions.
Sure, and there's no
So
mechanism to weed that type of person out.
there may be
Okay.
mechanisms. There may be, and this is where I don't have full authority on the example, but there is a certain you cannot go in naive thinking that because a person has a a 4-year degree or a 6-year degree because of certain factors, because now we're starting to deal with things like what kind of biases are acceptable, right? So we have rules in our world, in our country. We know that you can't discriminate on the basis of race, you can't discriminate on the basis of disability, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, these kind of things, these terms that we use.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I agree with you that these are all principles that we live by. And so the concern is that when you is that HR, not HR itself, but like where are there people, and I don't want this to turn into an entire witch hunt. That's probably not the way to do it. But you do not be naive. If you are a veteran getting out of the military,
Mm-hmm.
and you are faced with hiring problems, that's the way of the world. You're not going to get away from it. Maybe you don't deal with the same issues that other people have. I don't want to throw you out and say, okay, it's going to be hard and everyone's going to hate you. That's very jaded. It's very nihilistic. It's not a good attitude to put out to enter the world with. And then in inverse, it's the same way where like when recognize that there are people who will disdain you and will actively try to prevent you from getting a job or a position because of the things that you've done in the past. And maybe it's because they don't, maybe it hasn't nothing to do with you. They just hate military people because they had a bad experience. Maybe their dad was a thing. Maybe it's very, very straightforward, right? Maybe it's politically motivated. Maybe it's ideologically motivated. Maybe it's, maybe you made a comment that they misunderstood and then they hold that grudge for 30 years or whatever it is. So there's a certain element of it that you can say, veterans who go to college after the military tend to be a little bit older than their peers because, many kids go to college or they join the military. So being older has a certain set of benefits, like you're a little bit more capable of knowing what to pay attention to and what not to. You're a little bit more independent because you've been around for a while. You've lived on your own. And it's easy for veterans to hold disdain against other students, which, okay, fine. Probably shouldn't do that, myself included. And that's how I would kind of put all those things together. Is like, yep, it's going to be hard. Figure it out. You're going to do it. And the relationship of ideologically motivated individuals getting into positions of unspoken authority is always going to be the case, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. So you can't get away from it. It's people. People are people.
Yeah.
It's not like a happy-go-lucky conclusion, is it? Like,
well, it's reality. I mean it's life isn't all easy, and it's not all hard either.
Yeah.
So to present one viewpoint or the other is not a full picture.
Yeah, getting out of the military was difficult. And it wasn't getting out of the military that was difficult. It was going from being in the military to being in contracting to being in college to trying to look for a job and not having a couple of years of really bad experiences.
Well, and you mentioned earlier the kind of the short-term mindset, especially when you're deployed. It's you're thinking about today and tomorrow, and you're not thinking about a year from now as much. So the transition out of that, it sounds like you kind of stepped it a little bit. Like it wasn't a direct hard from deployment straight into standard civilian world. You went to contracting, which was similar, but
Mhm.
still the transition. I think
I
that's
think
I
there.
think that's not completely understood by civilians. Is the
I mean, I
difference?
think even military guys don't have, like, we're trying to figure it out as we go.
Mm,
Like, even veterans are trying to figure that kind of stuff out.
sure.
I think it was like 6 days between I stepped off a plane from Afghanistan and 6 days later I was in the classroom, and that was like
Oh,
kind of a culture shock. But of course, there's good and bad for it. I enjoyed the university I went to. I got to make some pretty good relationships with my professors.
hmm.
So there's something to be said there.
Yeah, yeah, and that maybe I'm just assuming, but it seems like being a little older would encourage you to develop a relationship with your professors, as opposed to the standard student would be spending time with their peers. I don't know, maybe because I
It
think there's
could be. I
maybe.
haven't thought of it that way. I think so though. Yeah, I could see that very much so.
I mean,
Maybe more likely to.
there's benefit to both types of relationships, but yeah, it seems to me that if you're a little older, you'd stand out. You can relate to the professor more, and the professor's like, "Oh, this guy knows what's up." He's not your
Yeah.
typical.
I still associate with two people from my college years. One of them is a professor, and one of them is a fellow student.
Yeah, yeah.
Two. So
Well, let's see
yeah.
if a listener thinks we kind of yada yada over the interesting part. Where would they find more about you and hear more about you?
Oh shoot. Well, I guess um if you wanted to go through the beginning, okay. So if you want to find out any of the work that I do right now, I am the guy behind a company called Redacted. The mission of our company, of my company, this product, this independent media company, that if you want to talk about our mission is, um, I'm a philosopher, dude. I want to talk about the ideas, and I'm a part of gun culture,
Mm-hmm.
American gun culture, right? So we run a podcast called the Redacted Culture Cast. That is, we air that Monday, Wednesday, and Friday with guests from various components of gun culture, whether it's like YouTube personalities to manufacturers to other writers to
Mm.
veterans to active service guys to cops to whatever. So the interviews and the podcast is really to focus on what I refer to as the philosophy of violence. And so, to be clear, when I think of
Mm.
the word philosophy, when we're talking about philosophy itself, it's not really about like, our business philosophy is. It's really about like what things you'd refer to as metaphysics, epistemology, ethics. And so it's a much more rigorous approach. What is true and right and good? Not
Mm.
what do we not just what do we like, but it's much more focused on that. So we talk about concepts, things like decentralization. We talk about values like individual responsibility. We talk about goals like, organization structures, or we talk about goals like skill set development. We talk about, so these are all things that are kind of in in my line. So
Mm.
philosophy of violence is definitely a major one. What is gun culture? And a lot of the inspiration from it came from an observation of what we'd refer to, I'm still referring to as American gun culture, but sort of like the meta trend of guns in the West, is that there
Mm.
was a major shift between generations as the kind of FUD generation kind of left the chat, kind of moved on.
Sure.
And the old ways were very anti-intellectual and very focused on things, and the new generation, our era, is very, very intellectual. We really care about what we think about. It's not enough to say that I have the Second Amendment. I don't really care about the piece of paper itself either. I really
Mm.
do care about the ideas behind it. What would lead somebody to write that paper down? Why was that considered a value in that era? How does it apply, if it applies at all today? What does this mean about reality? Do values shift with culture, or are these objective things called good? And
Mm.
then, or truth. And so this is how, I really want to focus on that one, because we don't really have a von Clausewitz today. when we look at training apparatuses, for the longest time, training skill sets in the United States has been driven by sort of B grade lawyers and this fear that everything you do is going to end up becoming a lawsuit.
Right.
And I understand that there's a certain element of reality to it, but that is not ethics. That is legality, and we need to understand. I need, if you're in a use of force scenario, you need to know whether or not your decision is ethical, and recognize that there is a distinction between ethics and legality. There is a difference between something being legal and something being right, and
Sure.
that is called maturity.
Yeah.
And so these are the subjects that we focus on. It's not that I would say that just because something is legal doesn't mean it's right. No, there's a certain correlation between the two. But that is the subject that we like to focus on. And so if you were to listen to it, you can find it on most platforms. It's called the Redacted Culture Cast. Spotify, Apple. I think we're on like Google as well. And then we do have the videos are also aired on YouTube and Rumble. So I do record in video format. So it's podcast platforms, YouTube and Rumble, and then in addition to that, our Instagram is the other side of the business that focuses on gun culture, aesthetics, and some of the harder questions that I like to. It's a little bit more creative. Let's put it that way. It's a little bit more on the. It's a little bit. My creative side is through mediums of film and like trying to depict different ideas in the way that we think about violence and gun culture, but it's a little bit more art focused, whereas the philosophy side is not artistic at all. It's very rigorous.
Well, yeah, Instagram is a visual medium, and
Yep.
philosophy is not a very visual concept. So
It can be, it can be portrayed as. I mean, there's also the field of aesthetics, but I do not come from the school or discipline that accepts navel gazing as a form of philosophy. I think that what most people, or what most of the West has been convinced philosophy is some sort of Eastern spiritualism combined with awkward pseudo articulate self-expression. It's probably going to be the easiest way of saying it. So, what I believe about the world is that all roads lead to Rome. Like, okay, that doesn't mean anything. That's a preposterous concept to hold. It's there is no such thing as right or wrong. Morality. This is where bad philosophy leads to negative impacts in culture. And I'll use an example when it comes to violence, is that morality is relative. It's relative to the individual. Wrong. Absolutely wrong on every conceivable level. Morality itself is not relative. People's ability to observe reality is relative. People's ability to make decisions based on morality is relative. It's relative to their ability to perceive. So the real question, like, for example, let's go with the morality is relative argument. Morality is relative. There is no such thing as objective morality. Okay, so now you're making a metaphysics argument. There is a thing, and there is an ability to perceive. Two different concepts. If morality these are kind of emotional arguments, but if morality is relative, then Hitler and Stalin were pretty good guys. They just didn't see it to completion. It might makes right. If that's the case, then I never rob you. I just write my way into your stuff. Right. You can't really hold a tenable argument saying either A, might makes right, or B, that morality is relative, because in order to say that morality is relative, you basically have to dissolve all fabric of reality down to this primordial ooze of meaninglessness, and so it's not a very good argument, and that's the emotional response. The metaphysics response is you're saying that the ability that reality is determined by individuals' capability of perceiving it. This what you're saying is that the apparatus of reality is that nothing really exists, only observation exists. That's not, is that like that, is that a tenable argument? I don't think so, but
Sure.
it's certainly a little bit closer to Descartes. That's a good push. So you might say that, okay, let's just say we know that the physical world exists. We've come to that conclusion. We know that information exists. We know that there are things that are kind of in line of true, like I am. That's a truth. I know it's true because I can conceive me right now. You and I are having this conversation. There is this thing that there is truth. The table in front of me is brown. The um 2 plus 2 equals 4. These are, you cannot change 2 plus 2 equaling 4 because it is an objective statement. You can't do that without destroying the fabric of reality. Sure. So then we know that at least that concept of numbers are necessary, and if that's going along the lines of modal logic, we can even start by numbers. If you and I are having a conversation, I stay in the assumption that implies that numbers are a thing, because there is 1 and there is 2. There is me and there is you. And so if that is happening, it's not just my perception, which, I mean, that's an assumption that you have to make anyway, but that's no different than believing in any other sort of philosophical foundation. Then I can start with, there is this thing called truth. Then we can expand that from numbers to science. That might be an argument, but science can't solve a certain question. That's morality. It's the is-ought divide. You'll never make it across. Facts don't make things moral. Facts inform, or facts fill in the context by which moral evaluations may be made, but those moral evaluations are made outside of or apart from facts. Science cannot produce morality. You cannot come to any argument about the existence of or arguments for morality from a test tube. All I can do from science, from this idea, which is an epistemological idea, which comes from, again, philosophy. The previous term used for science was natural philosophy, and that wasn't an accident. That was an argument understood by, how do we observe the objective world through reliable epistemology, through reliable observational structures? How do we think about how we observe so that we can learn things about the objective world, which came out of Christian humanism? And so you go down this trail, and then, so going back to the objective morality question of, so is morality objective or subjective? That's a hard question. And if you say it is subjective, then you say it doesn't exist. But no one lives that way. So maybe it's not true that it doesn't exist. Maybe it's limited. Because if morality doesn't exist, then anything is permitted. And if anything is permitted, well, then why are we even having the conversation? But we don't live that way. So it at least could be considered a social construct, because under all societies, we at least have some rules that we live by, whether it's between you and I. I trust that you will not lie against me. I trust that you will not steal me. These kind of things. We believe in these concept of rights. Where did those come from? This might come from the Bible. Most people, what we understand as far as human rights, comes from this idea that human beings are a thing, and they have rights. They have rights for reasons, maybe that were imparted by God. And so you keep following down this trail, and you're going to be forced between a decision of either, well, that either there is no such thing as morality, or it is out there and we are just not capable of perceiving it perfectly. Like gravity exists, does morality exist? And then maybe because we can't see perfectly, maybe morality out there, and I'll make the argument morality would be a black and white argument. We are just incapable creatures, so our eyesight is poor enough that we see in shades of gray. But that gives us an impetus. It gives us a direction. We are duty bound by existence through morality to pursue understanding what morality is, even though our eyesight isn't perfect. And that is an antidote to the modern problem of being aimless. If you tell me that, if you want to know why people are committing suicide en masse, is because we don't have anything to aim at. We don't have anything to live for, because either it's too easy, materialism, or it's been sucked of anything of valid meaning, multiculturalism. I'm not saying that cultures are not equal. I'm not talking about the evaluations of different cultures. I'm saying that if you remove the foundation by which anything is evaluated, that doesn't just produce some sort of utopia of equality or equity or whatever it is. It produces suicide.
Sure.
So this goes back to the veteran conversation. For veterans who get out of the military, one of the biggest challenges you're going to face is you do not have a deployment to defer to.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
You don't have a deployment to say, this is a hard question. But that existential crisis is sort of solved because you have something to focus on, whether it's rank or structure or current issues that you're facing within your unit, or what's your next move, or what's your next objective, or what's your next deployment, or what's your next mission. And when you get out of the military, you don't have any of that. Not immediately. Some people do. Some people know which direction they're going. That's not everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would say to people who are looking at getting into the military, and I guess I could probably do that story a little bit, but I don't want to, do only all of it.
Well, no, actually, I'll phrase the question that I always ask, because you're getting right into the answer. And that is, if a 17-year-old or 18-year-old came to you and said, I'm thinking about joining the military, or excuse me, I'm planning to join the military, what would your advice be to them?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to try to think through this before, and I really am glad that you asked the question. You sent the question over, so I think this was, of the things that you sent over, this was the one that I had to think the most about.
Okay. It's also the one I try to always ask. So
yeah,
good.
Okay. So I'm gonna I have 3 points for you. If a young person is interested in joining the military, I have 3 primary components, and then after that, I'll tell a little bit of how my story kind of turned out. My story sounds so narcissistic. I need to work on something better. But okay, so when you're joining, if you're considering joining the military, the first one is be honest with yourself. Be honest with your intentions. And that means, that is when I say be honest, I mean you have to ask yourself questions. Are you using patriotism as a veil? Do you just want to go see war? I joined the military because I wanted to go to war. I didn't, it wasn't out of patriotism. 9/11 wasn't the thing. It was like, no, I want to go to war. I want to see what war looks like. I don't want to just do a Saving Private Ryan. Oh, war tourism. I wanted to go see something. I wanted to know what it was. I wanted to be a cool guy. I wanted to be a strong, cool guy. I'm not trying to be, derogatory on this at all, but it's like, I wanted to have that mission, that discipline. I wanted the Army to make me into something.
Yeah.
I thought so hence special operations. So, I thought that, the first one is be honest with yourself. And that might look like writing it down. And I mean, even if you're not a great writer, write it down. Trust me. Don't write it down in public, write it down in private, and consider what your motivations are, what you think the military is, and what you think the military is going to be about, and what you're trying to gain from it, and what you want to do in it, and where you want to go. It's not an easy question.
Sure.
But it is be very clear about your intentions, to yourself, because they will be challenged. They certainly will be challenged. The second one is look for a mentor. And that doesn't mean, and I recognize that not being in the military means it's really hard to find a mentor because you don't know what to look for. But spend time looking for mentors, somebody who's been in the military, maybe in the job that you're looking at going into, whether it's you want to go into Ranger Battalion, or maybe it's what do you want to do, right? If you want to travel, I do not recommend going into Ranger Battalion. If you want to live in different parts, I mean, there are exceptions, but like if you want to move from base to base, if you want to consider being an officer, if you want to look at all these things, you should find somebody who's been in at least some adjacent level to that position, and talk and develop have a relationship with them for about 6 months before you sign the paper. Because they will help give you, and it might be from a mentorship standpoint, recognize that you only have so much of their time, and that's just the way of it. But I would recommend not the fear of being embarrassed about wanting to be a Delta Force operator, Navy SEAL guy should be less than your concern. Should be exchanged for a willingness to go talk to somebody, and not because they're going to make your life easier. But it's not so that they can tell you how to pass selection, because that's the easy part. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's not the only part that makes it difficult.
Right.
but it's so that you can, you're going to be focused a lot on the selection process, which is appropriate, but also being able to frame your mindset so you not necessarily know what to expect because we're naive, but know where you're going, and not have not know where you're going in the sense that you can manipulate the bureaucracy that is the government to get you into the exact position that you want in the time frame that you want, but to be a little bit more equipped to overcome the hurdles like the rumor mill and the how do you get to the S2 shop and get the right thing submitted, and how does this work, and these are good things to have. I would suggest a mentor. It's not always possible, but I would if you have, I would recommend pursuing one in person if possible. Definitely in person if possible, and you might only meet them 2 or 3 times, but I would really, really recommend it. And that's where you get to kind of don't be afraid of it, but be humble, and it's a good, don't be afraid of it. They're not there to bite you, and don't feel like you have to prove yourself yet, because you're proving to someone who's been in the military, who's been in some position that you want, by asking the question. That's proof that we can say, okay, you don't have authority over their decisions, but that's the second piece of advice. And then the third one, so the first one is be clear about your intentions. Second one is seek out a mentor. And then the third one, which is a little bit, it's advice against something, and it's do not see the military as something that will impart a sense of meaning to your life. Do not look for it.
Yeah.
Do not look for the military to give you a sense of camaraderie. Do not look for it to give you a sense of purpose and direction. Do not expect it to give you or produce in you discipline. It produces an environment where these things can happen, but it doesn't produce those things. So you will be in a team. That team will be required to be faced with certain tasks. That does not mean you will work together as a team. You will, just because you work with other people, maybe even some of them are like-minded, does not mean that you will build camaraderie naturally. Maybe you'll go through similar hardships together and still hate each other. It's not a good attitude. It's do not expect the military to produce things for you like that.
Sure.
It will not impart to you a sense of absolute purpose and direction. It'll give you a framework where you can work on that. It'll give you challenges to your own opinions about things. It will force you to turn maybe an otherwise manifested value into something real. You might have to live up to your values. You may be faced with very obvious decisions between easy cowardice and strong bravery. You may think that you were courageous. You may find out that you aren't the hero that you think you are, which is part of the process. You'll be opened up to your weaknesses and strengths and stuff like that. But also, there's other places in the world that do that. But it will not impart to you a sense of overarching meaning, and it will not explain the world simply. If anything, it will be difficult. But that's kind of what we do it for. And so those are the 3 pieces of advice. Know your intentions, seek out a mentor, and do not look for the military to provide an overwhelming sense of purpose. So, yeah.
Yeah, that really, especially that last one, a lot of guys, when they get out, struggle to find meaning outside of the uniform. And I think it's
not exclusive to military people. I mean, you got to look at that. You got to
sure,
look
that's
at
true.
No. Yeah.
That's true. That's a good point.
It's very frank for people in the military. Very, very, like, you're in, you're out. Now what? So.
Sure. Yeah, it's true. Kind of like, I guess, people who peaked in college. They think they associate themselves with being the star quarterback in college. Sure. Yeah, and they struggle to find meaning or value outside of the football uniform or something. That's true.
Yep. It's difficult. And so, so this is, if I can summarize this, and I'll go from start to beginning to end. And I know I've been doing a lot of the conversation today, so
that's perfect. The listener appreciates that.
I hope so. So there's a certain, when you, it doesn't matter what you do in life and it doesn't matter where you come from, you're going to join the military with this. If you do join the military, you engage in anything, whether it's college or work or social participation, you're going to join the world. You're going to enter into the chat. You're going to enter into the environment with a certain amount of naivety. Naivety is a combination of lack of knowledge or maybe holding on to believing things for not very good reasons, and innocence. We apply a certain amount of innocence. There's a difference between naivety and ignorance. There's a difference between being naive and being foolish. So you're going to end, it doesn't matter how many mentors you acquire, it doesn't matter how much information, how many books you read, it doesn't matter any of this stuff. You will enter some part of your life naive. You're just going to naive. And we all enter the world in this way. We all enter in some level of naivety, and eventually, and so what happened for me is that, I joined the military and I thought that Ranger Battalion was going to give me my sense of purpose. And so when I went to basic training and I was introduced to all these different people across the United States, and then some of those interactions were really great, and some of them started friendships that have lasted to this day, and some of them were like, goodness gracious, why would you ever say something like that? My first experiences with racism, my first experiences with all this other kind of crazy stuff, right? But that's what the world is, dude. It's not. We live a lot in a bubble right now, but fine, so be it, right? So I thought that, and I held this idea in my head that once I passed Ranger selection, the Ranger indoctrination program, I would be a real boy. It would be like this kind of, then I would not necessarily that I would have made it, but it was like, then I would no longer have to worry about these trivial things like, where am I going and what am I doing? Whatever, right? I had this idea of like, there's going to be this great sense of achievement, of graduating Ranger selection, and I would be fulfilled. Like they had this dream. Let's just say I held on to this dream for years of like, then I would be cool or something. And I'm not trying to be too foolish about it. It's not like I thought I was going to be Master Chief from the Halo series. It's just that I thought that some of my trivial problems of being a young man would kind of go away, because like, oh, well, I don't have to worry about, existential crisis. I have a deployment to get ready for. So I went to RIP, and a normal RIP class starts with about 120 people and graduates about 25 to 30. It's got a pretty high attrition rate, or it had. RIP is no longer a thing. RIP. So a normal RIP class was described to me, and I understood it from what little reading I had done. I thought it was going to be this really hard thing. But when I accomplished it, it'd be this sense of achievement, like I was one of the chosen. It's fantastic. So when I get to RIP, and when I get into the kind of waiting holdover to go into, because I graduated airborne school, which wasn't hard. Basic training wasn't difficult at all. Like it's not. It wasn't hard. Like I never thought I wasn't gonna make it. Airborne school, I never thought I wasn't gonna make it. Like there were definitely times where, like, man, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to motivate myself to jump out of the plane, but I'll tell you what, when I got to that door, I fell right out that plane.
Right.
So sure enough, but like there was never this time where I thought I wasn't going to be able to get to RIP. And it wasn't as hard. I mean, I grew up generally healthy. I had decent genetics. My family had educated me well. I knew how to shoot a rifle. In fact, I found the M4 very underwhelming. I was like, oh, it's a Mini 14 with a better magazine. Ooh, but like, this was back in the day, and so I go to my RIP class, and we get started, and we have 315 students.
Oh, wow.
Which you're like, I guess I'm now focused all on doing the thing, right? I'm focused on, okay, I have to graduate this. I have to pass RIP.
Sure.
And by the end of it, we graduate 285.
Oh, wow.
So it was like, by the end of it, it was like that was tough, but it wasn't that bad. I'm not saying I was a super soldier by any means, but it was like, okay, so the physical fitness was a pass fail, and they let people through. We know it. They let people through for numbers reasons or whatever, whatever. But, and many of those people found themselves kicked out of battalion very quickly. But what it did for a lot of us, and what it did for, a normal, you would think a normal RIP class would be something like everyone who graduated knew that they should have been there, or at least for the most part. For us, what it did to us is it robbed us of a sense of achievement. It
Sure.
was, so I'm sitting there on the parade field with 200 and something other dudes who, a small cohort of them, know that they passed, and they passed everything, and they know they did it well. And another cohort, another group of them knew that they just got pushed through. Like, there's people who got into Ranger Battalion who knew that they just got shoved through the system. Most of those people found themselves getting kicked out pretty quick.
Sure.
And then the third group was the majority of us, kind of sitting in that middle ground of like, did I make it, or did I get let through for numbers? Like my ability to like, I did the hard thing. I passed selection was robbed of me because some bureaucrat said, we need more Rangers or something like that. That was the way that it was presented, right? It was a little frustrating.
Sure.
And so what did that lead to? Is that led to a great sense of nihilism and or cynical. I became very cynical very quickly. I ended up getting stationed at the one Ranger battalion that I didn't want to. I got sent to 3rd Bat. And so, and then I ended up becoming one of my team leaders that I worked under. We did not get along well, and it's my fault in many ways. And we were like oil and water, Christians and atheists, this and that. Like, it was just personalities, Midwest kid with a East Coast team leader, weird combination.
Right.
And our relationship didn't go very well for a while. And I am not innocent in this. And so, I got this impression that I became very nihilistic. I became very cynical. Oh, it's not what I thought it was going to be. I thought Ranger Battalion was going to be all James Bond meets Master Chief, cool guy missions, and, olives in my martini kind of thing. And yet really it's like, what did you expect, dude? You're like 19 years old with a bunch of other 19-year-olds being like, we're all jacked up on testosterone and deployment. So like, do you really think it's going to be that way? Like, what did you really think this through? And the answer is no.
Right.
So my naivety was faced with reality, and it collapsed. It just crushed, and something rushed in to fill that void. And so my naivety, I had this idea of what Ranger Battalion was going to be, and it turned out to be different than what I expected, because you're naive, and that's what happens. You have expectations about the world, and they don't meet up to your expectations. And so what happens is that naivety collapses, and something has to fill the space. And what tends to fill the space is cynicism, or at least skepticism, where you're like, maybe all the stories that I was told were not real. And skepticism, if it allowed to manifest and are allowed to take root in your perception of the world, becomes cynicism. And cynicism is looking at the world through this lens of like, it's all corrupt, it's all twisted. You're cynical towards everything, and like it feels fun to be like jaded and a Billy badass, and you're like, oh, I'm just a cynic, and you're like, okay, cool, dude. Like, you're just a low brain cynic, but fine. But this is in retrospect. But like the cynicism it does give you a sense of like maybe fulfillment in some sense for a while. And then cynicism, if allowed to manifest even deeper, turns into nihilism, which is there is no meaning. Everything is shit. Everything is trash. And there is no such thing as value. There is no such thing as good. Everything is just turtles all the way down of, and that's an old philosophical statement of that the world itself is devoid of meaning and purpose. That there is no way to find it.
Sure.
And that's where nihilism is a very dangerous place to be. So you find this black pit of meaning and value out there, and you're like, I thought the military was going to give me meaning, and it didn't. And and this process repeated itself when I went to Ranger School. It's not like we got pushed through, but it wasn't the sense of achievement that I thought it was going to be. And instead of it being so much of a struggle for me, I actually kind of took it out on my father by robbing him of the ability, the chance to be proud of his son. And so that's a story for another time. So, but eventually I kind of hit this rock bottom position of, I was in battalion. I had my tab. I was pretty secure in my position, or whatever it was. I had kind of figured it out, a couple things in battalion, and, I wasn't like the ideal candidate for everything, but I was very, very nihilistic. And and it was a bit of a religious moment, but it was like, okay, I recognize that my worldview of it's not that I just recognized it in a day. It took time, but cynicism. I became extremely cynical, and I looked at everything as if I knew it was false, and I knew everything was a trap, and everything was out to get me, and everything blah blah blah. And I just became very very cynical. And eventually, that cynicism was revealed to being an unwillingness to look at the world. I knew the abyss was out there, but I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to look out. I didn't want to look into it because it made me feel bad. Like, oh, you were stupid. You made naive decisions and whatever. Until it was I recognized that I had a relationship. That I was trying to live a dual life. I was trying to author myself as the creator of reality. I was like, I had a very high opinion about myself, thinking that I knew the world. And that was one way of saying it, but also that I wanted to have my cake and eat it too, in a sense of responsibility to reality. And it was a very harsh confrontation with Christianity. And it's like, I wanted to be a Christian, but I wanted to be a Christian on my terms. I wanted Jesus to meet me on my terms. Jesus, I get to be a badass, and I get to do the ranger thing of, like, drink all the time and sleep with a bunch of women, and also also be a Christian or something. Like, it was this very, and you could talk about it in, like, Puritanism, and you could talk about it in religious statements, but what it was is that I wanted to believe in something, even though I was very cynical. I was like, it came to this confrontation of, no, you're cynical because you thought that you could become the author of reality, and reality said no. Okay. And so then I started looking at it, because, like, I had this idea that there is no sense of meaning, because anything can be good or anything can be bad, and anything can be the perspective of any perspective of the world could be true, and there was no such thing as truth, just power or something like that. All these different nihilistic attitudes of looking at the world, and eventually I had to stare into the blackness and say, I had to learn to navigate it. I had to learn to navigate that really dark cynicism and that really dark nihilism. And eventually out of that, I think wisdom could be obtained. And it was like, I could start to see things like, no, just because it's hard, just because you thought that the PT test was going to be the hard part. The hard part is figuring out why. What are you doing? Why are you here? Why are you trying this? And that's a hard question to ask, but you have to pursue it. And so, and so I thought, so cynicism and nihilism turned into this question of, why should I try? And the answer that came out of that was, if you want to do, if you really, or what you believe is good is what you pursue. You pursue what you think is good. And if you want to pursue things that are good, you have to make yourself capable. Because there's this thing that we do to ourselves, where there's a difference between being a good man and being good at being a man. And this is a distinction made by Jack Donovan. And the difference between being a good man and being good at being a man is such that one deals with morality and the other one deals with capability. And so you make this mistake of thinking that if I'm capable, then I won't have to worry about morality, because that's really the issue that you're challenged with. But really, in the world that we live in, capability is the easy part. If you can tell me why, if I can know why I'm going to do something, I can figure out how. I can figure out comms plans, night raids, night vision, suppressors. I can build bombs or explosives. I can write a book, or I can build a family or whatever. But if I don't have that why, if I'm trying to substitute that why for something like self-fulfillment, whatever the hell that means, then I... then and just in that broad generic sense, that then none of the how matters. None of the I can't figure out how to pass buds or ranger selection. But if I have a why, if I can figure out if I can focus on the things that are valuable to me and actually pay attention to what I value, or be deliberate about that, and then recognize that I am not the author of reality. I have to submit to something, and that might be my will, or that might be my mind, or that might be whatever I call objectivity, or that might be God. Whatever you submit to is your God. If I'm not willing to efface that in any way, shape, or form, then I will live in perpetual nihilism, because I am trying to deny the reality that I need to aim myself at something. And it's really convenient if I say, "Oh, I can't do it because I'm not strong enough." Then what I'm doing is I'm creating this illusion for myself that I am absolved of the responsibility of acting because I'm not capable of doing it. Oh, I would have saved that person, but I'm too weak, so I can't be held responsible. But I had good intentions.
Right.
I would have done the right thing. I would have been the ranger better, but I wasn't strong enough, or I was betrayed, or whatever. And it very quickly turns into this moral masturbation of, and I don't mean that in like the masturbation is moral. I mean, you're masturbating your sense of morality, because you're creating in yourself this illusion of being good, this feeling of being good, without actually doing it. So if you're sitting here and you're looking at, there's a difference between being a good man and being good at being a man. There's a difference between morality, or capability, and morality. And you face that capability question. If you try to solve the moral question with the capability question, you try to solve morality with science, you're going to ultimately end up with some sort of, you're going to end up false. You're going to end up on a false ground. You're going to create an illusory island, and your conscience and your mind will tell you that it's an illusion. And that illusion will become nihilism. Whereas you have to try to figure out what you build your foundation on, and that can't be just yourself, because when you go out into the world, you realize you make decisions, and those decisions are not always correct. Sometimes you didn't have the right information, and sometimes you made a bad decision because you wanted the wrong thing. And so it happens. And so this difference between being a good man and being good at being a man, it becomes this moral question of, well, if I know I can be good at being a man without being a good man. I know I can be strong and courageous without being moral. But is the inverse true? Is it possible for me to be a good man without, in at least some sense of the matter, being good at being a man? And I think the answer is no. Because you can't claim morality for things that you can't do or you haven't done.
Yeah.
And that goes back to, we are very capable of producing ourselves the feeling of doing something without actually doing it. We call that masturbation. We generally look at it with a little bit of like cringe and gross. And so you can, just like you can produce, just like you can masturbate sexually, which is kind of gross. You can also do that same thing morally. You can produce in yourself the feeling of being moral without actually being moral, which leads to the question, is this neutral? No, it is not a net neutral. It is not a net neutral at all. You're not just producing this feeling. It's not ignorance is bliss. It's ignorance is pathological, and deliberate ignorance is pathological and genocidal, or maybe not genocidal. It's suicidal for sure.
Yeah, sure.
But it also is the thing which it also is a thing which provides motivation within a person to be willing to dehumanize other people. It's not about self-love. But if you have dehumanized yourself to just an autonomous robot that lives by maybe hedonistic desires, whatever I want, therefore is good, then you're going to dehumanize other people. So if you're going to go to war dehumanizing them, that is a bad thing. You will be an ineffective soldier, but you will also be an immoral soldier, because if you treat your opponent as less than human, you will fight them as less than human, and you will be effective less than. Because so it'll eventually catch you, maybe in the long tail, but in the short tail so nihilism is this, why should I try? It's all screwed up anyway. And that attitude is cynical, and that attitude requires to be held the idea that you can be good without being capable of good. It's not that being capable makes you good. It's necessary, but not sufficient for morality. And at the end of the day, we find out that we desire not just to be good at, but we want to be good people. We pursue something, and we have values. There are things that we put value in. We want to pursue a value. And that is the foundation of morality. And therefore, it gives you the answer to, if a man has a why, how he will endure any how. And that was the hard crack at the end of the whole military timeline question of, I had become cynical middle way or early, in part way through my time in the military, because I thought that the military was going to give me meaning, and I was avoiding the hard questions that were before me. And then that took time, years to work through. And then when I got out of the military, I thought, well, people outside of the military aren't going to have this problem. Wrong. It's everywhere. And so then it was, I'm going to go to school, and school's going to give me this, it's going to answer my questions. Wrong. It's just going to, it's going to be part of the process of learning and writing and thinking. And then, I'm going to graduate school. I'm going to hold a job. Wrong. It's not going to, none of these things fulfill the final question, but they're part of the process of pursuing it. And so you start seeing the world that it isn't an easy answer, but it's out there, and there is something to be pursued. And it's there is something true. There is a boon. If you stare into the darkness long enough, you'll start to learn how to navigate it very, very, very carefully. And inside the shadow, you will find the boon. You will find the thing, the little bit of treasure, the little bit of wisdom that you can take out of it, and maybe you can share it with somebody else, or maybe you just hold on to it yourself. But you have to go through the darkness to figure it out. And if you're not willing to, then you'll never find it, because cynicism is very, very self-fulfilling. It's easy. It's not self-fulfilling. It's very it feels good when it's an easy answer, but it will ultimately destroy you.
Yeah.
In a very tragic way. You'll become a shadow of yourself.
Well, it's also easy because if, especially nihilism, if nothing can be changed, then it removes personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
So it's a very simple answer.
Nihilism is effectively worshiping yourself as God. Oh, and if I can't figure it out, then it can't be figured out.
Sure.
There's a reason why there's a correlation between nihilistic worldviews and great travesties in the world that we live in. So that is that. So I hope I was able to give you the answer, the long form of cynicism gives way, or naivety will give way to cynicism. Cynicism will have to be navigated to find wisdom. So naivety is in metaphysics statements is, it is true and I don't know why, or it's this naive approach to there is truth, and then cynicism is there is no truth, and then wisdom is a return to understanding that there is truth, but it takes work to understand. So you must navigate cynicism to come to wisdom. Cynicism will always replace naivety, because naivety will always be crushed by reality. You will believe things for bad reasons. We all do it. Then you'll become cynical. Navigate cynicism till you to pursue wisdom. That's it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How I Embraced the Suck. If you enjoyed the show, tell a friend. And as my Girl Scout den mother used to say, stay frosty.
I try to do the same thing on my end of the show. It's like I don't try to come in over prepared,